Did you know that back in the late 1970s, North Korea was actually richer than South Korea and its economy was growing way faster? But today, if you look at the two countries from space at night, the difference is shocking. South Korea is filled with bustling cities, and North Korea is almost completely dark, with just a single dim light in the capital. It's kind of crazy, right? How two countries with the same people, the same geography, the same resources, how they end up with such different outcomes. Well, you see, my friend, there are actually 7 unique forces that determine whether any country over time either gets richer or becomes poorer. The more it harnesses these forces, the more prosperous it becomes. And the more it drifts to the wrong side, well, the worse it gets. So today we're going to walk you through each of these 7 forces along with real-world examples so you can see clearly why some countries get rich and others don't. Welcome to Alux, the place where future billionaires come to get inspired. Alright, so we began our discussion here today by talking about North and South Korea, right? And they're basically the perfect way to see the first of these forces in action, which is freedom versus control. So after the Second World War, the Korean peninsula was split into 2, and both halves, honestly, started from almost the same place. Same people, same geography, both devastated by war, both poor and underdeveloped. Actually, North Korea had a bit of a head start. In the 1970s, their GDP per person was nearly double that of South Korea's. It had factories, hospitals, and schools that, by global standards at the time, were actually quite modern. But North Korea had total state control, which meant that every farm, factory, and company was run by the government. The state decided what you did, how much you earned, even where you lived. South Korea, on the other hand, embraced economic freedom. The government wasn't perfect, there was corruption and even dictatorship early on. But it opened up to global trade, encouraged entrepreneurship, and invested in industries like steel, shipbuilding, and eventually technology. Basically, it lets people and companies innovate and trade freely. So at their core, the two countries were on 2 completely different paths. And therefore, they had completely different results. At first, North Korea's central planning gave the illusion of order, but the economy wasn't actually producing much. It was actually being propped up by loans from the Soviet Union, which we'll talk about later, okay? When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, though, so did North Korea's economy, and it never recovered. North Korea's GDP per person today is less than $1,500, and South Korea's? Well, it's over $34,000. South Korea produces Samsung phones, Hyundai cars, and K-pop, while North Korea produces little more than coal, propaganda, and empty threats of nuclear war. The lesson here is simple, okay? You can control your people or you can let them prosper, but you can't do both. Economic freedom creates incentives for people to work harder, invent better things, and take risks because they can actually benefit from the fruits of their labor. On the other hand, state control kills that spirit, and that is what the force of freedom versus control really means. Now, the second force that decides a nation's future is integrity versus corruption. And nowhere is that clearer than when you compare Singapore with Nigeria, 2 countries that gained independence in the 1960s. So, if you'd asked literally anyone which country would have been richer 6 decades later, they would have said Nigeria without hesitation. And here's why, okay? Nigeria has oil, natural gas, iron, gold, limestone, diamonds, and really fertile land. Singapore, on the other hand, was a dingy swamp that you could literally drive across in less than an hour with traffic. But today, the numbers speak for themselves, okay? Singapore's GDP per capita is over $70,000, making it one of the richest nations on Earth. But Nigeria sits at about $2,000 per capita. Now, we're not going to chalk this up to a single thing, okay? But definitely one of the main reasons for this is how differently both countries handled corruption. Singapore's founding leader made fighting corruption his top priority, and today Singapore ranks among the 5 least corrupt countries in the world. By contrast, Nigeria is hovering around 150th out of 180 countries, and according to the World Bank, it's lost over $400 billion to corruption since its independence. And this is what the force of integrity versus corruption really shows us. If a country wants to get rich, the country has to get rich, okay? Not just a bunch of cronies. All right, moving on to the third force that shapes a nation's destiny is education versus neglect. And for this one, let's compare Austria with Pakistan. So after World War II, Austria was in ruins, okay? It had very little in the way of natural resources, but it made one deliberate choice. It invested in its people. By the 1950s, Austria was spending around 4 to 5% of GDP on education, building systems that combined academics with vocational training. Today, Austria's literacy rate is over 99%, and its education system feeds directly into high-skill industries like engineering, pharmaceuticals, and finance. So, it's no coincidence that it now ranks among the top 15 richest countries in the world with a GDP per capita above 50,000. Pakistan, on the other hand, has taken an opposite path. Despite being the 5th most populous country on Earth, it has consistently spent only about 2% of its GDP on education, and the results, well, they're kind of devastating. Only around 60% of people in Pakistan can read and write, and for women, that is closer to 45%. That means that tens of millions of children never set foot in a classroom or develop even the basic skills to participate in a modern economy. And just as bad as that is the fact that Pakistan's best trained engineers and doctors consistently leave the country for better opportunities abroad. All of this just goes to show the real gold mines of a country are its people. If you don't nurture them, you are wasting their potential. And that is why education is so important. But here's the thing, okay? Even if your country has a decent education system, you can't rely on it to teach you the skills that will actually get you ahead in life. Real success isn't taught in schools or universities, it is built through the skills and habits you practice every single day. And that is exactly why we created the Alux App, your ultimate toolkit for personal growth and wealth building. Inside the app, you'll find lessons on the exact skills that separate the average person from the rich and successful: negotiation, entrepreneurship, investing, communication, personal finance, and leadership. Think of it like having a personal coach in your pocket, keeping you sharp, motivated, and moving toward the life you've always wanted. And as a special thank you for being here with us, if you scan the QR code on screen, you'll unlock an exclusive 25% discount on your yearly plan. So don't just watch from the sidelines, my friend, go all in on you. Because the smartest investment you'll ever make, it isn't in stocks, real estate, or crypto, it is in yourself. All right, so moving along here today, the fourth force that shapes a nation's destiny is transformation versus extraction. And to show you what that means, let's compare the Democratic Republic of the Congo with Switzerland. So the DRC is one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth. It has minerals that power everything from smartphones to electric cars, and in fact, it supplies around 70% of the world's cobalt, which is a critical material for batteries. Yet, despite this immense wealth, the DRC remains one of the world's poorest countries, with the vast majority of its people living on less than $2 a day. Tragically, it's one of the only places in the world where you can literally stand on trillions of dollars worth of resources and still be dirt poor. Switzerland, on the other hand, has almost no natural resources, but what it does have are industries based on transforming and perfecting natural resources. For example, Swiss watchmakers take small amounts of steel, glass, and sometimes diamonds and turn them into Rolexes and Patek Philippe's worth thousands of dollars. Swiss pharmaceutical companies turn basic chemicals into life-saving drugs, and Swiss engineers turn raw steel into the most advanced industrial machinery in the world. The result is that Switzerland now ranks among the top 5 richest nations in the world with a GDP per capita of over $90,000. You see, Alux, extraction economies like the DRC rely on digging wealth out of the ground and selling it as is. And while you can capture a lot of value from raw materials, you can't create much. A kilo of gold might be worth $60,000, but when that same gold is transformed into a luxury watch, it could sell for $500,000. Transformation has a multiplier effect, okay? And that is why the countries that get rich move up the value chain. They don't export cocoa beans or mine cobalt or cut diamonds. They make chocolate and batteries and jewelry, because digging resources makes you money once, but transforming them makes you money forever. And that is how transformation makes countries rich. All right, moving on once again, the fifth force that determines a nation's wealth is innovation versus stagnation. And the clearest way to see this is by looking at Japan and the Philippines. So geographically, they've got a lot in common, right? Both are island nations in the Pacific with access to rich fishing waters, shipping routes, natural beauty, and both were heavily influenced by Western powers. On paper, their starting positions were not that different. Nowadays, though, when you think of Japan, you might think about Sony, Toyota, Panasonic, Nissan, and Nintendo. But can you name a single company from the Philippines? Let's be honest, okay, for most people abroad, it's just the place where you hire a cheap virtual assistant. Japan is a rich country today because after World War II, it poured resources into science, technology, and manufacturing. But by contrast, despite being one of the wealthiest countries in Asia in the 1950s, political instability, corruption, and weak institutions prevented the Philippines from becoming what it really could have been. Stagnation locks countries into cycles where each generation basically inherits the same limitations as the last. But innovation breaks that cycle, and that is why it can determine a country's future. All right, so the sixth force that determines whether a country thrives or not is prudence versus waste. And there's no better example than Norway and Venezuela. So back in the 1960s, both nations discovered that they had vast oil and gas reserves, like otherworldly amounts of wealth just sitting there waiting to be extracted. But what they did with that wealth couldn't have been more different. Norway treated this as a once-in-a-planet opportunity. They started drilling and selling their oil, and the government set up the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which used their oil money to invest globally. Today, that fund has over $2 trillion worth of assets, which means the government has around $340,000 for every one of its citizens just from that fund. Venezuela, on the other hand, is an entirely different story, okay? Get ready for this. You see, Venezuela's proven oil reserves are 60 times larger than Norway's. 60 times! But instead of saving that wealth, the corrupt government pocketed it for themselves. And instead of diversifying their economy, they doubled down on oil only, and when prices crashed, the economy collapsed, and they started printing so much money that prices were doubling every few weeks. Literally, okay, Venezuela went from being the richest country in Latin America to a place where people have to smuggle toilet paper across the border. Understanding the force of prudence is really quite simple, okay? Countries that get richer don't waste their wealth. Norway used oil to buy the future. Venezuela burned its oil and its future along with it. And now we're on to the seventh and final force of today that shapes a nation's future, and that is long-termism versus short-termism. And the contrast here is between China and Russia to make this crystal clear, okay? In the late 1970s, when China was recovering from a devastating famine, Deng Xiaoping, the new leader, came up with a bold plan. So while still keeping the Communist Party firmly in power, he opened up the economy to private enterprise and invited foreign investors. Gamble on China's long-term growth. And it worked. In just 4 decades, China literally lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty, and the growth never stopped. Today, China's cities are filled with skyscrapers. It's home to world-leading tech companies like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. And it's the world's second largest economy with a GDP of over $18 trillion. A little further north, however, is Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia inherited vast natural resources, a massive territory, and a highly educated population. It could have had a fresh start and a promising future, but they didn't build out a long-term plan. Instead, Russia neglected the industries of the future and stayed dependent on the quick cash grabs from exporting oil and gas. The result is that today, despite being nearly twice the size of China, Russia's GDP is only a tenth of the size, roughly $2 trillion. And the gap is only getting bigger here. At the end of the day, you can either spend the future or you can build it. but you can't do both. And that's the power of long-term thinking. Alrighty, Aluxer. So those were the 7 forces that determine whether a country gets rich or becomes poor. And remember, okay, if you're serious about building these skills that will make you richer, the Alux app is the place to go. Just scan that QR code on screen today and you'll unlock a 25% discount from the price of your yearly plan. Trust us, okay? It is the smartest investment you will make in yourself. All right, thanks for spending some time with us today, Aluxer. We'll see you back here next time. Until then, take care, my friend.